Today I'm sharing how I use salt to create snowy textures in watercolor, and more importantly, how to get good blooms instead of muddiness and stuck salt. I'll be cutting between two different snow paintings. One is a cooler one is a warmer one. So you could see how the same techniques react differently with color, moisture, timing. And if you want to see the actual full painting, it is up on my Patreon. Actually, all three of these are up there. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is timing with your salt. When your paper is too wet and you add the salt starts to dissolve. And so instead of pulling the pigment outward, creating those star-shaped blooms, it just basically melts into the puddle. So what you'll end up seeing is a very soft, blurry texture or nothing at all. And the pigments spread back into that area once the salt dissolves. So you'll get some faint halos, but nothing crisp or snowy. So basically there's too much water, not enough resistance. So the salt can't pull that pigment because everything is already so wet and floating in there freely. So that's why waiting a little bit matters. When the shine has just started to fade and the water is still active, but it's slowed down enough for the salt to grab that pigment and push it aside, that's where it's going to create those blooms. Another thing you want to look at is how much salt to use and why less is more here. So I use a lot less salt than you might think. When you put down too much salt, here's what happens. That moisture gets pulled into too many directions at one time. So instead of one pigment bloom spreading outward, you get lots of those tiny little crowded blooms, which don't really look all that great. It just looks like little sand particles. So fewer grains are going to mean that each one has a chance to pull moisture from the paper. So what happens is they create that larger, softer snow technique or that crystallization look when you do that. And I found that out by accident because I was, painting with my mom one day and we got up to get a cup of tea and we left our painting. And when I came back, I was in shock at how beautiful the salt had done. And I'd never had that happen before. And I realized that I hadn't put a lot on. I just was sprinkling it because I was like, I don't know if I really want to do this. So I was so happy when I came back after that 15 minutes to see what it did. So that was, a little surprise mistake that I learned. So another thing that I want to talk about is using different salts here. So I tried different salts, many different salts, and each one reacts a little bit differently. Those finer salts will give you like a subtle speckling, while the chunkier ones create more bold and icy blooms that really read well as snow. This is why I love mixing my salts, and I have a little container where I keep all of them. And once I'm done with the salt and I wipe it off, I scoop it back up and put it back in that container so I reuse it. So that really gives me some surprises. It keeps that texture from looking repetitive because I have different ones in there. Patience and drying. Do not rush this process. This part matters a lot. Let it dry naturally for at least 15 minutes. You don't want to blow dry it. Blow drying is going to blow the salt everywhere. You don't want to use a heat gun because then it gets too hot and that heat makes the salt stick to the paper and then it stops the pigments from moving. And it's also a bear to try to get off. Sometimes it will just sink right into your paper. So watercolor just really needs its time to do its thing. And honestly, walking away is the best technique. This was a little bit more difficult because I was doing this live with my Patreon. So I actually did 2 of them at a time. And another live I had done separately. And we just watched the paint dry and we talked about other things while we were doing it. These are raw, unedited moments from a live painting. So there's no fixing here. There's no perfection. So these are just demos that I did. And I'm just letting the materials react and accepting whatever happens, happens. And honestly, that's where the magic is. And that's what we talked about in my Patreon. It was, don't put so much pressure on yourself. Just take this as a learning moment. This is a demo that you're doing and it will take some of the pressure off for you. And I think having fun is probably the most important thing. So here are a few other things that people often miss with salt, especially for snow. I think this is going to add some value for you. Paper matters more than what people think. Salt works best on the 100% cotton paper. Cellulose papers absorb unevenly, so the blooms can look a little dull or just blotchy instead of getting those crisp looks. And your pigment choices sometimes can affect the bloom strength too. Some pigments bloom beautifully, others barely react. And granulating colors, which I've been playing with a lot, will often give a stronger texture. Staining colors tend to bloom less, and that's why salt sometimes can feel unpredictable to you. It's often the paint, not so much the technique sometimes. And something else you could try is if your paper is tilted, gravity will compete with the salt. So for the snow, I usually always have my paper flat so those blooms radiate outward instead of streaking downhill. I had a little bit of that because I had tilted the paper while I was talking with my patrons on one of them, and I did notice that I had more blooming upward, and it was because I had tilted the paper. Something else to talk about is don't touch it once the salt's down. Every little touch, tilt, table bump, all that stuff kind of reacts to how it moves on your paper, so that moisture will move. So once the salt is on, it's hands off until it's dry, which is so hard for me to do. That's why walking away, getting that cup of tea, a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, whatever you have to do to keep your hands off of it. And then the other question we get a lot is, when do I remove the salt? So this is another thing, is timing. You want to wait until your paper is fully dry. If you brush it off too soon, you're going to smear that pigment back into the blooms and you're going to lose some of that texture. And something else to talk about is salt weakens the paper. So you want to make sure that you use the salt intentionally. So salt will break down the paper surface. It's fine for backgrounds like snow, but not great if you plan to do some heavy lifting on your paper or scrubbing afterwards. So keep that in mind. Another thing to talk about is weather and humidity. It matters because high humidity is going to slow that drying time down. So it's always hard when someone tells you, wait 15 minutes. Well, if you're in a hot, moisture area of the world, that can definitely change your time. It can make your blooms either softer or larger. Dry air tends to speed things up, so it can shrink your blooms if it's really cold. So that same technique again on a different day may render different results. Less control equals better mindset. Salt is a collaboration. I love this, not a command. When you are more focused on trying to control it, I think it's less magical. Planning where to place it probably means a little bit more than controlling the result. So I knew I wanted those blooms up at the top of those trees in that area to get that crystallization up there. So that is my approach to using salt for snowy textures. It's about timing, patience, and letting the paint do the work. Every piece, remember, is going to turn out a little bit different. And I've said this before, but that is part of the magic. So if you want to see this technique used in real time, I do have the full raw painting session over on my Patreon where I share the entire process there from start to finish. And I'm just curious, have you tried the salt technique before and has it worked for you? Have you been having troubles? And hopefully if you have, this has answered all those questions. And if you want to keep going, I do have another video on salt that you might want to check out next. All right, we will see you in the next one. Have a great day.